Hello, my name is Emlyn Guinea, and I'm the head of programming for CIIS Public Programs. I'm excited to share this talk with world-renowned mycologist Paul Stamets. This event was recorded live on December 3rd, 2021. We hope you enjoy it, and thank you for supporting CIIS Public Programs.
Well, thank you so much. I'm honored to be here. And in these times of COVID, year two, where many of us are so distanced away from each other, but we are sharing this space and time, figuratively. And we are truly at a time critical in the evolution of our species on this planet. It's important as Earth citizens that we take responsibility for our actions and the downstream consequences. I'm in a very remote island in British Columbia, and I want to acknowledge the unceded territories of this island of the Kalus people who so graciously and generously opened this environment for us. So I'm going to be talking about psilocybin mushrooms and the mycology of consciousness. And this is a talk that spans a lot of time and takes us to the cutting edge of the most current research that's unfolding. So I welcome you all. I know there's more than 1,000 of you who have come together as our community here. So without further ado, I'd like to begin my slides. So I will share a screen. Hopefully this will work. And I think it's working. Okay. So my talk, Psilocybin Mushrooms and Mycology of Consciousness, is actually an extension of our dear friend, Ralph Metzner. And Ralph Metzner, who was a professor at CIIS, wrote a book, a great book called The Ecology of Consciousness, which I love this book, and I love the concept that your consciousness is an ecosystem. And in that ecosystem, what are the dynamics? What are the different pathways of nutrition that are feeding thoughts that inform you, and not only emotionally, but also inform your intelligence? I think it's time for us to have a higher level of ecological intelligence and to understand our place, not only in our ecosystems, physically, not only on this planet, in the context of where we are now, and the evolution of life in the universe. So I'm going to just go through some history here that I think is important. And there is a unusual and interesting cave art on the Sicilian Plateau in northern Algeria. And the plateau was literally called the Plateau of Running Rivers. But because of climate change, note to self, the Sahara Desert has encroached, and the deforestation then subsequently occurred. But over 7,000 years ago, the artists here wanted to communicate something that I think would cross into the future, into the present. Obviously, the artist was very excited about mushrooms. And mushrooms being put into honey was a common practice really throughout the world, well known in Mesoamerica, but also in Europe, is a preservative, because honey, because of the high sugar contents and its antimicrobial properties, would prevent mushrooms from souring. Well, because when you put psilocybin mushrooms in honey, it infuses the psilocybin into the honey and begins a biofermentation process. So putatively, that is, we think that this may well lead to the creation of psychoactive meads in Europe in particular. Now, there was the Bavarian Beer Purity Act in 1516, which actually banned specifically mushrooms, henbane, and other psychoactive plants from being put into beer. So the Bavarian Beer Purity Act was sort of an act, I think, of institutional aggression to suppress indigenous people of Europe's use of psychoactive substances. Before the Christianity and the Orthodox religions, indigenous people were celebrating in the forests. Our lifespans were not that long. And so recoupling of individuals in the forest was common practice. during these rituals. So how much do we not know? Well, of course, 99% of this. There's only these threads of knowledge that have persisted throughout history, and we have a glimpse to what our ancestors were actually participating in. So these are just the actual cave art on the left. And then it was redone by Kat Harrison and then Jonathan Meter, quite true to form. And so the bee person here and the mushrooms adorning them is also in the same cave complex. Other pictographs were discovered, also showing mushrooms. And this is important for people to understand that from a mycologist point of view, the shape of the pileus, the cap, is really, really important. And from us looking at this is not a porcini, this is not a chanterelle, this is not a shaggy may. This is a conic capped mushroom, which is classically in the genus Psilocybe, the genus that contains the majority of the psilocybin mushrooms. Now, so what were these artists trying to portray? Are those spores coming from the mushrooms to fertilize the brain? Are there thoughts being stimulated from the mushrooms and it's bidirectional? Of course, this is all open to interpretation. So we go forward to about 400 years BCE, and the Eleusinian mysteries were being practiced from about 1500 BCE to 500 AD. That's almost 2,000 years. And here's a depiction of Demeter giving her daughter Persephone a mushroom. And legend goes to the origination of Greek culture, the origination of the seasons. When Persephone would consume the mushroom in the fall, then she would go into the underground, literally and figuratively, and that would be the onset of winter. And so during the fall harvest festivals, when these mushrooms are so common, and in this region of Greece and extending into Italy, into the Alps, Psilocybe semilanciata, the liberty cap, is quite common. So I find this extraordinary because this 2,000-year period of history here, look again, 1500 BCE to 500 AD, also was largely coincident with the Mesoamerican mushroom stones that were found mostly in the Pacific slope of Guatemala. Now, these persisted into about 500 AD. So for over 1,000 years, these mushroom stones were made. And what did they mean? Were they like signify a family's heritage? Were they statues to honor the heavens so rains would come, so much of the water was collected in catchments? Was it fertility? And again, this begs the imagination. But the fact that these exist today speaks to an ancient and deep history and mystery of the use of, I think, magic mushrooms. So the fact that this was happening in Greece and Mesoamerica at the same time, I see this as a synaptic junction in a sense of opposite ends of the planet. And peoples, indigenous peoples, were rejoicing and being informed of the psilocybin mushrooms. When the conquistadors invaded Mesoamerica, Central and South America, there was a priest, Sahugun, who came, and he, in 1529, actually recorded the use of magic mushrooms. And here's one quote that I found quite fascinating. These they ate before dawn with honey, and they also drank cacao before dawn. The mushrooms they ate with honey, when they began to get heated from them, they began to dance, and some sang and some wept. Some cared not to sing, but would sit down in their rooms and stayed there pensive-like. Then when the drunkenness of the mushrooms had passed, they spoke one with another about the visions that they had seen. So this was recorded or re-recorded in an excellent monograph by Roger M. and R. Gordon Wasson in Les Champignons hallucinogènes du Mexique, which was basically a treatise on many of the new species that were unknown to science, but known to indigenous people, and they were recorded. Unfortunately, when Les Champignons hallucinogènes du Mexique was published, it was published a few weeks after Rolf Singer and Alexander Smith published a monograph in a journal called Mycology. And because they published these same species first and gave them names, then unfortunately, much of the work and the names, that is, were usurped by Singer and Smith. And so the famous Psilocybe wilsonii then became a secondary species epithet, and other species then prevailed in the scientific literature. This is the way it goes in science. Whoever publishes the names first in the scientific literature and deposited specimens in herbariums, their names prevail. So it was the graciousness of Maria Sabina, a Oaxacan Mazatec shaman, who introduced psilocybin mushrooms to R. Gordon Wasson and Valentina Wasson. Now, this is important for people to understand that Valentina Wasson was the mycologist. She was a Russian physician. She studied and knew mushrooms in Russia by Latin names. She knew many, many species. And she was very much attracted to mushrooms when R. Gordon Wasson, on their honeymoon in the Catskills, when they found mushrooms, he was aghast at her enthusiasm and excitement for finding these beautiful mushrooms. He came from an English perspective of mycophobia, and she was mycophilic. And so actually they invented those two terms, mycophilia and mycophobia, because they were astonished at each other's cultural bias and affection in reacting to the presence of mushrooms. That led them on to a lifelong study of the ethnomycology of mushrooms. Now, it's important because I met R. Gordon Wasson several times. I attended 3 lectures of him. And in every single lecture, he gave credit to Tina Wasson. He gave credit to her voluminously and often cried in tears, trying to express his gratitude to his wife, who unfortunately died in 1957 from cancer. So at that time in 1957, Life magazine came out. It was distributed to millions of Americans, primarily, on the doorsteps in the middle of the Cold War. And inside Life magazine was basically a field guide to psilocybin mushrooms of Mexico. In the magazine, they disguised the name of Maria Sabina and her village, but this secret did not remain very closed. Soon, thousands of people were flocking to Mexico to find Maria Sabina. It was very disruptive to their culture. Maria Sabina was a practicing Catholic. And so the interesting convergence of Catholicism and the Mazatec use of psilocybin mushrooms. The mushrooms that the Mazatecs were using were primarily Psilocybe zapotecorum that you see here. And it is not Psilocybe cubensis. There was a disdain of Psilocybe cubensis. It was associated folklorically with the conquistadors. It was thought that perhaps Psilocybe cubensis came with cattle when the conquistadors came to Mesoamerica. But Psilocybe zapotecorum was the indigenous, with the species that indigenous peoples primarily used. A new book has just came out. It's fun. It's called Mycelium Watsonii. I wrote the foreword to it. It's a very interesting rediscussion of portraying the adventures of Tina and R. Gordon Wasson and their adventures into Mesoamerica. So it's beautifully illustrated. I very much encourage people to check out this book. It's beguiling and interesting, and I think it's largely historically accurate. And again, it also gives enormous credit to Maria Sabina and Tina Wasson, 2 of the giants in the field of psilocybin ethnomycology. So R. Gordon Wasson consumed Psilocybe cerulescens. When I was in the womb, I think I was in 7 months in my mother's tummy. And so I was born in a small town in Ohio. There I am. I'm the cowboy on the right. I have a twin brother, you can see over there on the left. So this began my journey. I remember my first encountering puffballs and throwing them at my twin brother, and they explode upon impact. And it was tons of fun. And my mother came out of the house screaming, "Don't throw puffballs at your twin brother, it may make him blind." Well, she went back in the house, and I thought that was good information. So I pelted him with more puffballs. But that was my earliest memories of mushrooms. Is there was so much fun to stomp on, and so then my life evolved, and then I consumed psilocybin mushrooms, and then this is what I looked like. So here I am. I'm actually 19 to 20 years of age in this photograph. I was a very hairy young man. So this is my first run of Psilocybe cubensis, growing psilocybin mushrooms in a pressure cooker at my brother John's house in Seattle, Washington. Now, I want to give thanks and acknowledgement to my father, to my mother, and to my brother John. They have all since passed. My brother John first really got me into psilocybin mushrooms. He went to Yale. On break, he would go down to Central America and to Colombia, came back with these fabulous stories of consuming psilocybin mushrooms. And I was the youngest child in a family of 5. And so I idolized my older brother, John, and we became tight and good tripping buddies. So John and I journeyed many times on psilocybin mushrooms. And if you read the foreword to one of my books, Psilocybin Mushrooms of the World, you can hear and you can read about some of our unique escapades and finding one of the largest psilocybin mushroom patches I've ever seen. Thousands and thousands of psilocybin mushrooms right in front of the police station near the University of Washington in Seattle. So I progressed to the Evergreen State College, and I was mentored under Dr. Michael Bugh. And so was Jonathan Ott, Jeremy Bigwood. And the three of us end up studying psychoactive plants and psychoactive mushrooms. Michael Bugh wrote an article basically on the proper and accurate analyses of psilocybin, which was called as a government as a witness for the defense when the government was prosecuting people for possession. So he showed that their analytical methods were flawed. He wrote a accurate methodology for detecting psilocybin and psilocin, baeocystin, and norbaeocystin. These are psilocybin analogues. And then the DEA was actually pretty impressed, and Michael applied for a DEA license, which we got. And so Jeremy Bigwood and myself were covered by a Drug Enforcement Administration license for about 10 years. Jeremy went on, but I stayed on longer. And so this became a center. The Evergreen State College became a center of research. And in the Bay Area, there was Terrence McKenna, and in Oregon, there was Gary Menzer. You'll see photographs of them. And we began a series of mushroom conferences. So this is a mushroom conference from 1979. This was in Silco Station in Oregon. There's Jonathan Ott on the right. There's Jeremy Bigwood, Dr. Gaston Guzman, who wrote the world monograph on the genus Psilocybe from Mexico, Dale Leslie, myself, Jim Jacobs, and then Stephen Pollock, a medical doctor from San Antonio, Texas. And then, of course, at this time, there's so much excitement because we discovered that these psilocybin mushrooms are growing in our backyards, literally. In Northern California, from San Francisco all the way up into Vancouver and north all the way up into Northern Canada. And so the need to be able to trek to Mexico to find psilocybin mushrooms was quickly, that narrative changed because there are so many psilocybin mushrooms growing in the Northwest in pastures and associated with wood chips. So then Terrence McKenna and his circle and our circles intersected. There's my daughter, Ladina. This is at Brighton Bush Hot Springs. And then Terrence and I and Jonathan Ott and a number of other psychonauts started putting on some conferences in Palenque, the ethnobotany conferences that Ralph Metzler also attended. And then we started these mycomedia conferences from about 1980 through about 1992 or something like that. And the mycomedia conferences were focused really on gourmet and medicinal with a heavy emphasis on psilocybin. Now, I cannot emphasize this enough. These are times of incredible paranoia, incredible politicization. Nixon's war on drugs put gay right activists, the anti-war activists, the African American movement, the Native American movement, we were all marginalized and put into the same silo with a war against drugs. And so Richard Nixon found it politically advantageous to demonize all of us because we're in opposition to the Vietnam War. So we were always concerned that the federal government would come and bust us. And so we were still pushing through this. And because we had a DEA license, we had some sort of umbrella of protection through the work of Dr. Michael Bugh and what we were doing at the Evergreen State College. So we started doing a series of other conferences. This is a conference we did at Brighton Bush Hot Springs, the Millennium Mushroom Conference. I knew the Merry Pranksters, and I realized I knew a lot of the scientists and psychedelics. And so I brought them both together at the Millennium Mushroom Conference in 1999. There's Alexander and Ann Shulgin, there's Andy Weil there, there's Gary Linkoff, many other people that you might recognize. And so it was an extraordinary event. And then there was the Psychoactivity Conference, and these conferences then went to Europe. And there's, of course, Alexander Shulgin again, and Ann Shulgin. There is Albert Hofmann in the center, Stacy Schaefer, those of you who know about her work with peyote, et cetera. So this became a worldwide movement, and really focused in North America and Europe, and also then in Latin America, and then increasingly in South America. So this is Psilocybe cubensis, and this is a simplified life cycle, just to bring everybody up to the same level here. Mushrooms produce spores. The spores typically are sexual in that two spores have to come together, they mate, and then the downstream mycelium is binucleate. They have one nucleus in each spore, where they go and they merge and they mate and form mycelium. The mycelium has 2 nuclei per cell. And then in this is fertile mycelium is then capable of reproducing a fruit body, a mushroom, literally in just a few days. So the mycelium can be resident for weeks, months, even years. And then under the influence of a drop in temperature, introduction of water, the mycelium wicks to the surface, exhales carbon dioxide, inhales oxygen, and then surprisingly light. Those 4 stimuli stimulate the mushroom mycelium to produce a reproductive structure called a fruit body, otherwise known as a mushroom. Now, I just love this photograph. This is one that's recent. This is Psilocybe cyanescens in a garden. It's called a wavy cap. Now, if you look closely, you'll see a bluing reaction on the stem. And then when you take a spore print, this is Psilocybe cyanefibrillosa, and you see the spores fall according to the radiating symmetry of the gills. But in the field of mycology, spore color is really important. So I came up with a simple rule, it's a generality, that if a mushroom has a purple, brown to black spore print, and it bruises bluish in color, then it's almost certainly a psilocybin mushroom. Now, with every rule, there are exceptions. For those of you who want to know the exceptions, Stropharia ruginosa, subaruginosa, albocyanea, these are other species that are bluish in color, have a bluish purple-brown spore print, but they are not psychoactive. Okay, but they're not deadly and they're not poisonous. But generally speaking, this rule stands true today. If a mushroom bruises bluish, a gilled mushroom, not a pored mushroom, a gilled mushroom, mushrooms with gills, and the spore print is purplish brown to black, it's almost 95% certain it's a psilocybin mushroom. Of course, you must be able to identify mushrooms accurately in the wild, and so please be careful, consult an expert, and make sure you know what you're doing. So Psilocybe zapatacorum, as I mentioned before, this is the one, and there's another one called Psilocybe cerulescens, derumbes. They're associated with landslides. And so many of these psilocybin mushrooms associated with disturbed grounds, which is very interesting. A mushroom that was indeed used for sacred purposes is Psilocybe mexicana. And Psilocybe mexicana does not bruise bluish. So here's a really interesting one that indigenous peoples figured this out. There's a lot of little mushrooms that have this shape, mycenas, for instance, conoscibes. This mushroom is packed full of psilocybin, but almost no psilocin. So psilocybin is a prodrug to psilocin. Psilocybin dephosphorylates in the gut into psilocin, and psilocin then is really what enters into your bloodstream. Psilocin also is in the mushrooms. It comes in, but in this case, it's just psilocybin. So I went on and I published several new species. This is Psilocybe azurescens on the left, Psilocybe liniformis, variety americana, Psilocybe cynofibulosa, and Psilocybe wiley. So these are the 4 species that were new to science that I discovered and named in the scientific literature along with my co-authors. So some of the species, for those of you from Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, elsewhere around the world, in southern Chile, et cetera, there are these interesting long-stemmed conic cap psilocybes. In this case, this one is Psilocybe pelliculosa because it's got a pellicle that the skin can peel off. So Psilocybe pelliculosa is a psilocybin active mushroom. It does not bruise bluish very much. It's pretty weak. And so, a threshold dose may be 20 to 30 specimens. You have to eat quite a few of these. Psilocybe semilanciata, the liberty cap, grows in grasslands, especially around ponds where there's sheep or there's cattle. In wet, cool areas, this one on the right is taken from a photograph from Scotland. It grows in Washington State, Oregon. It grows in Nova Scotia. So it grows in cold, wet grassland environments. It's very high in psilocybin, very low in psilocin. So this one rarely bruises bluish also. So the rule that I gave you is for the bluing psilocybes, but there's lots of other psilocybe species that don't turn blue. So, and this is the one I showed that was in the garden, Psilocybe cyanescens, the wavy cap. And it is a potent psilocybin mushroom. And this is Psilocybe cynofibulosa. It's associated with the rhododendrons. So a really good place to find psilocybin mushrooms is in rhododendron gardens in October. And any place where rhododendrons are planted, oftentimes mulching of wood chips are used. And that wood chip mulch around rhododendrons, you can see it creates a perfect little microclimate that these psilocybin mushrooms burst. Now, on the lower left, you'll see Psilocybe cynofibulosa. The mushrooms froze about 2 days before I took this photograph. And so upon freezing, the mushrooms turn very, very strongly bluish. And there's another species, Psilocybe baeocystis on the right. And it's a very unique species. It's becoming increasingly rarer. It seems to be associated with Douglas fir cones. And I can't really explain, nor other mycologists can explain why this species is becoming less and less frequently found. The species named after Dr. Daniel Stuntz is Psilocybe stuntzii. It's got a membranous ring on the stem. It turns blue. So whereas you may only take 4 or 5 at most Psilocybe cyanescens, you'd have to take 40 or 50 Psilocybe stuntzii in order to have the same activity level. But when I wrote my first book, Psilocybe Mushrooms and Our Allies, I wrote it in particularly after finding these cluster on the left. We have Psilocybe stuntzii side by side with one of the most deadly poisonous mushrooms in the world, Galerana marginata, also known as Galerana autumnalis. There's one on the right that has rusty brown spores, and one on the left has purple brown spores. Now, they're growing so closely that they're touching. And in fact, for us, psilocybin mushroom hunters and wood chips, we look for Galerana marginata, this deadly poisonous mushroom, as an indicator species, meaning that the habitat also is suitable for producing psilocybin mushrooms. So in the wood chips, you'd find Psilocybe stuntzii, Psilocybe cyanescens, Psilocybe baeocystis, and a species around the Bay Area called Psilocybe ellenii. So here on the right is their psilocybin mushroom, Psilocybe pelliculosa, side by side with a Galerina. So this is why you really have to be careful. Wild hunting of psilocybin mushrooms can be a dangerous activity for those uninitiated who are not careful. You can become killed, folks. You can die from eating these mushrooms in pursuit of psilocybin mushrooms. So Galerana marginata has the same cyclopeptides that are present in Amanita phalloides. Many of you heard about the death caps. There's in Maine and in New England, there's Verosa or bisporigeri. Sorry, I can't pronounce it right now. And so, these are deadly poisonous mushrooms that contain alpha ammonitins. So another deadly poisonous species is Phyllotina phalaris, also known as Conostomy phalaris. These have rusty brown spores. They do not bruise bluish. So this is why the majority of people that are consuming psilocybin mushrooms are consuming those that have been grown. And the easiest one to grow by far is Psilocybe cubensis. So Psilocybe cubensis here has about 1% psilocybin. That equates to about 10 milligrams of pure psilocybin. And there's the microdosing protocols. There's a low dose, a medium dose, and a high dose, as illustrated here. In a survey that we did recently, about 72% of the respondents are in the medium dose range. They're eating 1/10 to 1/3 of a dried gram of Psilocybe cubensis. So with one gram being a threshold dose, 1/10 of a gram is subsensorium. So a microdose, by definition, typically is in the range of 1/10 to 1/3 of an active dose, a dose that you can feel. So if you take a small amount of psilocybin mushrooms and you feel it, that's not a microdose. A microdose you should not actually feel. So the psilocybin mushroom cultivation became very popular, especially because of Terrence and Dennis McKenna wrote a book called Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide, growing these mushrooms on grains, in jars and in trays, very easily done. And so this is by far the most highly consumed psilocybin mushrooms in the world. I would suggest it's probably in the 98th percentile of all psilocybin mushrooms consumed is in Psilocybe cubensis. Now, it's important that you know that Psilocybe cubensis is a very rapidly growing mushroom. So these are ideal stages for consumption. The veils are closed. The veil extends from the cap edge to the stem, and it protects the gills. But what you're seeing, these beautiful specimens right here with closed veils, in the matter of 2 to 6 hours, the caps expand. And even though the caps may look larger, the mushroom may look larger, there's no increase in mass. In fact, the flesh of the mushroom thins and the gills get broader, and the gills have spores on them. There's no psilocybin in the spores. So actually the potency of the mushroom declines and the mass of the mushroom does not increase. So this is a big concern because some people are very allergic to spores. And in fact, in a study of asthmatic children, 50 children, over 100% of them were allergic to Psilocybe cubensis spores. That's an extraordinary high number of asthmatic children. Now, asthmatic children become asthmatic adults. A good friend of mine, unfortunately, his wife died from an asthma attack. So people should be concerned about harm reduction and safety. And this is a big concern I have, because after these mushrooms get large like this, and they have the appearance of being more, which might incentivize growers to produce larger mushrooms, their immune system of the mushroom declines radically. And so they're not as strong in their ability to prevent contaminants, bacteria, other molds from growing. So co-occurring with the maturation of these mushrooms is unfortunately contamination. So this is something that we're extremely concerned about. A number of methods are used for being able to ingest these mushrooms, and they're commonly ingested via the Aztec tradition in chocolate. So mushrooms are ground up, put into chocolate, and chocolate really masks the flavor. Some of these mushrooms are very unappetizing. And so this is a common way of microdosing or even macrodosing. Very important you label these so you don't have someone having an accidental ingestion, which has happened all too often. So again, please be very, very careful. If you know of anyone who's doing this, or if you're participatory, of course you should do it where it's legal. I want to emphasize that as the absolute bottom line. But if you notice anybody making microdoses or macrodoses, it's really important that they're properly labeled so you don't have children or adults unsuspectingly consuming these, and they may not be ready for their experience. Another interesting vehicle for ingesting psilocybin mushrooms, of course, they're water soluble, but it took me a long time to figure this out, is that if you take psilocybin mushrooms, fresh ones, of the bluing clade, cyanescens, azurescens, cubensis, and you put it in a jar and you put ice cubes on it and you let it melt in the refrigerator, about 2 degrees Celsius, 34 degrees Fahrenheit. And then as the ice cubes slowly melt, then you create blue juice. And so you can actually extract this. And it's a simple water extraction method. Hot water doesn't work. Room temperature water doesn't work. It's this very, very slow ice cube melting over mushrooms does. Now, there are so many research institutions that are excited about psilocybin, but all of these research studies are focused on psilocybin, the molecule, and not psilocybin mushrooms, except until just recently. But there are now institutions from Harvard, Stanford, University of California, Imperial College in England. So there is a massive amount of research, as most of you know, on the therapeutic benefits of psilocybin. Just yesterday on clinicaltrials.gov, if you go into clinicaltrials.gov, where clinical trials are supposed to be registered, there are 77 registered clinical trials using psilocybin. So I have to check my time here because I don't, okay. So I'm really interested in these meta studies. And this is one that particularly caught my attention. It's a retroactive study of prisoners by the US Department of Health and Human Services, 480,000 people surveyed. Now, association is not causation, but it can be. But they found a really strong correlation, the authors did, of a 27% decreased odds of past larceny or theft if you had one experience with psilocybin, 22% decreased odds of property crime, 18% decreased odds for violent crime. Now think of that. Psilocybin reduces crime in society. Psilocybin is non-addictive. And so for those of you who have not journeyed on psilocybin, for us who are deeply experienced in this, it's very common after a deep and strong dose of psilocybin, the next day when you look at the mushrooms, you say, no way, I'm not touching these for months, because you're processing. And the experience is so profound. And moreover, even if you wanted to take them several days in a row, you build up a tolerance extremely quickly. And so the day one will not have the same experience of day two in terms of what's happening to you in perceived psychoactivity. Another study that came out also analyzing found this, there was a significant reduction in partner-to-partner violence. If one partner had experience with psilocybin mushrooms, they were statistically significant reduction in partner-to-partner violence. Wow, mushrooms, psilocybin mushroom experiences reduce crime, reduce violence. And this is potentially a game changer for our society. Now, there's a lot, of course, controlled clinical studies are important. We have to be able to disambiguate all the cofactors. Is this association with other lifestyles? Is it the subset of people using psychedelics just tend to be less prone to criminality? These are all legitimate questions, but the preponderance of evidence is steering towards this narrative that psilocybin reduces crime. Now, like a pebble in a pond, if there is a person who's experienced some violent trauma against themselves, it's not just themselves, it's their immediate family. It's their neighbors. Oh my gosh, you hear about so-and-so next door? It emanates out through their cousins, through the families, through the communities, through their villages, through the cities, through the state, through the country, through the world. Truly, we're living in a time of massive trauma. The indigenous peoples to this very day. But the opposite is true. The benefit of psilocybin in reducing trauma, reducing violence, and helping people heal also is a pebble in the pond. It's a pebble in the pond of positivity. And so you hear about the person who had this amazing turnaround experience. They're a better person. They've come to terms with their traumatic events, or they're working on the pathway to resolve their trauma. That becomes the story. That becomes a narrative. So all of us are using psilocybin mushrooms. We are pebbles in the pond of the ecology of consciousness. We can make a difference. So I want to talk about microdosing. So I came up with this formula in around 2015, 2014, and it's a combination of psilocybin, lion's mane mushrooms, and niacin, nicotinic acid, the flushing form. And I've been working a lot with lion's mane mushrooms for many, many decades. And there's lots of great research on it as a regeneration of myelin on the axons of nerves, and to be able to potentially be used for treatment of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and Dr. Kawagishi gets credit for this. 1994, he was looking for antibacterial agents. He stumbled upon lion's mane mushrooms having coding for nerve growth factors that cause neurons to regrow. And so I got really excited about this. And because of my experience with psilocybin and gourmet medicinal mushroom, it became a Venn intersection of interest. And then I thought about niacin. Well, it's well reported in the 60s and 70s, if you want to come down from a bad trip with psilocybin, you take niacin. And so that was in common knowledge. Even my brother John told me about this. He had the federales in Colombia coming up the mountainside, and they all took a whole bunch of niacin and they immediately came down. Of course, I think they would probably come down anyhow. But in any event, so I looked at this and I thought, I think they didn't quite get it right. Actually, I think niacin potentiates psilocybin in a microdose. And the idea being with a vasodilator, there'd be more blood flow. When you take niacin, if you haven't taken 50 milligrams, 100 milligrams of niacin, try it. You'll, in about 15 minutes, start itching, get red. And I thought by stimulating the endpoints of the peripheral nervous system, oftentimes neuropathies show up as a deadening of the fingertips and the toes. Before the vascular system collapses, if you can get a vasodilating effect from niacin, then you can deliver these neurogenic compounds, psilocybin and, in this case, erinacines from lion's mane mushrooms, to the endpoint of the peripheral nervous system. Moreover, because of the itching flushing effect, if you were to take not 100 milligrams of niacin, but a gram, by trying to take 10 times more psilocybin so you could get high, it'd be an adversive. It'd be like the antabuse with alcoholics. So it would then allow for hopefully for the FDA to approve this, because they have such an adversive reaction from trying to misuse a microdose into a macrodose that it would prevent this psilocybin from being used at high doses. And then microdosing, of course, again, you're not feeling any effect. So this is the rationale that I had coming up with this formula. Folks, I never suspected it would turn out as well as it did. So this was a hypothesis that I had. I was speculative, but to give credit where credit is due, James Fadiman is sort of he's the father of microdosing. Actually, let me put that back into context. In indigenous cultures, from Mesoamerica to Europe, it's very common for foragers to taste the mushrooms they find as they forage. It's a natural consequence. I think all foragers do this. Many of you can relate to this. And so by taking, and we knew with liberty cap mushrooms in the 1970s, if you take some liberty cap mushrooms, just a few, then the liberty caps would jump out of the landscape. You have better pattern recognition. You could memory map the shape of the mushrooms and then look in the environment, and then they'd sort of jump out at you. So it was actually a very useful way of enhancing your discoveries. But James Fadiman came up with a Fadiman protocol, which is a microdose, and there's one day one is on, and then there's 2 days off, and then there's 1 day on, and you repeat. I thought, well, I do a lot of in vitro propagation. I grow a lot of mycelium in culture. Cells take time to divide. And I thought to myself, by having the stimulus of 1 to 4 days on, and then 2 to 3 days off so it doesn't normalize. So you resensitize. But that will build the neurogenic pathway, allowing these nerves to be able to regrow. So that was also my hypothesis. So again, here is the dosage ranges, basically using Psilocybin cubensis, 1 dry grams, 10 milligrams, and low dose, medium dose, high dose. And in our survey here, we found that 72% of the participants were in that 1/10 to 1/3 of a gram. And we partnered with Quantified Citizen, who developed an app for Apple devices, iOS devices. A Droid device is coming out, and it's at microdose.me. And we have over 14,000 participants who are surveyed. What they're microdosing with, how much they're taking, are they using it with chocolate, are they using it with lion's mane or niacin? How often are they taking it? It also goes into what's your age, even your income level, all these demographics to try to characterize. Because my partner, Dr. Pam Crisco, and I had many conversations, and she would say, the problem with so many of these studies, they only look at 50 or 100 people. What if we looked at thousands of people? We would see signal from the noise, and this is something that we then, this is all vetted through the boards to make sure that they are ethical. And so we have now published our research just about 2 weeks ago in Nature Scientific Reports. It's in the top 1% of all articles ever published in the Nature publication ecosystem, Nature Medicine, Nature Physics, et cetera, and the top 1% in scientific reports. So this is really interesting because now there was some criticism about, well, it's not placebo. Well, this is an observational study. How do you do a placebo with an observational study? Placebos are done in controlled studies where there's a cause and effect with a drug and then a placebo. This is asking people to self-report. Now, we do agree that there could be a bias, a response bias, because we found in the survey that people who were more depressed were more motivated to microdose. Interestingly, we had over 4,000 people that were non-microdosers with over 4,000 people who were microdosers. This was really surprising to us that so many non-microdosers would go to microdose.me to then also record their activity. I was wondering, did they want to get a baseline before they started microdosing? So we had a very nice balanced data set. And we found, quite interestingly, some major observational trends. Again, these are self-reported. We have a second paper that we have submitted, and the question about placebo is very well discussed, you might say, as well as expectancy bias. But in this study, we found with mood and mental health on the PANAS and DAS schedules, with the stack and with psilocybin in any form, the graphs are very, very similar. There was a massive reduction in the report of depression and anxiety. So hugely significant that people who microdose with psilocybin in any form had a reduction in depression and anxiety, and an improvement in positive mood and a reciprocal but not as significant reduction in negative mood, or the amplitude of which. So this was okay. This is okay. We still have this problem of disambiguating really what's going on here. Is that people have a proclivity to microdose? Are they joining a community of people and now they feel active in their treatment? And so they're self-reporting and their expectancy is influencing them? Yeah, you could argue that. Again, we get into this placebo effect. Without a controlled study, you don't know. But we thought, well, what in our microdose.me study, is there something that would be independent of this placebo argument? And we found something truly extraordinary. And it speaks to the TAP test. This is a TAP test. There's a validated test for Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, traumatic brain injury, dementia. And in Parkinson's, as an example, there is no increase in the TAP test. Now, what is the TAP test? The TAP test is alternating fingers, and it can be finger to thumb. But in this case, because of the iPhone, and the app that has been developed, we did it specifically for the iPhone, so you can have a double tap alternating back and forth. How many times can you tap in 10 seconds? So we had everybody, including the non-microdosers who participated, thousands of people engaged in the tap test. And so all this data was blind to us. There we have about 8 co-authors on this. The statisticians, the biostatisticians got all the data. None of us co-authors ever saw it. We had no ability of even looking at it. And then we found something truly extraordinary. Well, at first, we looked at between under the age of 55 and over the age of 55. Age-related neuropathies occur. People lose, unfortunately, your neurological health declines, new news, as you get older. And sure enough, over the age of 55, taking psilocybin in any form, there was a significant, albeit not that greatly significant, 0.041, 0.05, as many of you know, is a threshold of significance. And so, which means basically, there's a 95% probability that your data is giving you a valid signal. 5% chance it may not, just generally speaking. So we started carving into this more deeply, and we found out something that was really amazing. When you took the stackers, that is people using niacin and lion's mane and psilocybin microdosing, away from this general population that used psilocybin in any form microdosing, the chart that you see on the lower left there became insignificant. In fact, the significance was because over the age of 55, the stackers using niacin, lion's mane, and psilocybin was so strong in their signal that it made the other population look significant, albeit not that significant. But here the p-value is 0.004. Now, I ask you, and I ask anyone who's a critic or a skeptic, what placebo could code for increase in the tap test in a population of 55 plus year olds? It'd be a very unique placebo. And in fact, of course, it's almost irrational to presume that it is a placebo. That's because we believe there's a psychomotor benefit. And I want to show you now the cellular data that gives evidence to what we're seeing in this behavioral data. These tap testers went from approximately 43 taps to 73 taps in 30 days of alternating your fingers. Now, each dot is a reporting day. There is a learning curve in the initial few days, but the data speaks for itself. There is something going on here, folks, a psychomotor benefit. And we think it is related to neurogeneration. So we started doing cellular MAPK tests. These are mitogen activated protein kinases that code your genes to express nerve growth factors and other compounds that lead to neurogenesis. There is neurogenesis, there is neuroregeneration, and these proteins basically bind with receptors that then allow your nervous system to start to regrow and heal. So this became really interesting to us. And so we had significant results on called track A and track C. And track A is in the hippocampus. Track C is in the cerebellum and the cortical cortex. And these bind in stimulating nerve growth factors. Track A you see here, and track C is in the peripheral and central nervous system. And P38 also codes for nerve growth factors. So when we started doing these combinations, the chart on the left for track A, as you see there, is PEP, that's lion's mane extract, and psilocin. The sum of those two, they predicted additive sum. You can see them adding on top of together. When we add these two together, we had synergy. And so we had more than 2.5 times the track A binding affinity and expressing these proteins that are binding with the receptors that code for neurogeneration, central and peripheral nerve regeneration. And then with that same compound, and then we had a turkey tail with psilocin and niacin, in the sum, we had over a 6-time increase and the binding affinity. So this got us very interested in looking at every possible combination. And so then here, looking at track A again, we started looking at the psilocybin analogues. These things are co-occurring in psilocybin mushrooms, which people are consuming. When you take Psilocybin cubensis, you are taking baeocystin and norbaeocystin too. So with lion's mane and baeocystin and norbaeocystin, there's the sum, the stacking significantly increases it. And here on the right, you have lion's mane, baeocystin, and the sum, the stacking significantly increases it. So what we have found now over baseline, the total MAPK impacts across all regions of the brain, these compounds are stimulating neurogeneration, whole brain involvement. Now, I mentioned this because in looking up what nerves are involved in doing a tap test. Well, let's start at the beginning. You have to think about it. There's ideation. You look at your fingers, so you have that connection going back and forth. Your brain sends a signal. It's a lot of parts of your brain are involved in a simple alternating tap finger test. And so this is what we think we have found. We have found a combination, and this is just the beginning, folks. We're just opening up the door to this. But the combination of niacin, psilocybin, and some of these other mushrooms are causing a synergistic reaction far greater than what you would expect of just stacking these on top of each other. And that's how you have to presume they're coding at the same receptors. So even that to the side, we're seeing way beyond anything. So I just want to end by talking about, the consumption of mushrooms by primates. I looked into this a number of years ago, and there's 22 primates that are known to consume mushrooms as food. Well, 23 when you add humans, we're primates. So here's the Golgi monkey consumes 12 times its body weight. I know that's a phenomenal. We Americans, I think, consume maybe 3 pounds of mushrooms per year. Can you imagine consuming 12 times your body weight in mushrooms? So there's a long and interesting history and the coevolution of primates and the consumption and identification of mushrooms that are helpful, that are edible. Well, this is why I think we need to re-examine the stoned ape theory. Now, it's not a theory, it's a hypothesis. I talk about this a lot. But Terence McKenna and Dennis McKenna came up with this. It's definitely a stoner's sort of conversation. But, many of the greatest scientists in history have been made fun of and mocked. And we know lots of examples, Galileo, Copernicus, lots of scientists throughout history have been made fun of. And we find out later that they actually were way ahead of their time. So there was a sudden increase in the cranium and the brain, about 2 million, and then years ago, then 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens suddenly appeared. Now, Terence postulated with Dennis that, well, maybe this actually stimulated our brains to become larger, we became smarter, we got better at survival, and that gave us a competitive edge against Homo erectus and Neanderthals. Within 4,000 years of contact, when humans migrated into Europe about 40,000 years ago, within 4,000 years, Neanderthals became extinct. And yet we still have some of their DNA. I have about 3.5% Neanderthal DNA. And many of you do too. If you go to your 23andMe test, you can see your lineage with Neanderthal DNA. But this is really interesting to me because now we have the cellular data. And so I think we should re-examine what Dennis and Terence postulated. And they were ridiculed for this. But this occurred at a time of massive climate change. We're experiencing massive climate change. And it increased glossolalia. There's a great image by Alex Gray here. And the elocution of thought, the bonding. And so when our primate ancestors were walking across the plains, this is an animation from my friend Louis Schwartzberg. Thank you, Louis, for this. And primates would be coming out of the savannah. They'd be tracking animals. Animals would be pooping. If you're tracking animals, you look for poop, you look for footprints. These mushrooms are growing out of the poop of ungulates. You consume this, they look edible, quote unquote. You share it with your friend and then your family, then suddenly in 20 minutes, you begin this amazing experience. You have this shared experience of a super consciousness. You suddenly see yourself in the context of the ecosystem. This are stimulating neurons to grow. And so we, I think, are at a time critical in the evolution of the human species. I want to say that I think psilocybin could help us evolve into a new species. We are not the Homo sapiens of 200,000 years ago. We better not be the Homo sapiens of 200,000 years ago. Look where we are today. It is time for a quantum leap in the evolution of the human into a new species, a species that celebrates our diversity, that protects our ecosystems, that acknowledges indigenous wisdom, because the things that psilocybin teaches us is the unanimity of being, that we share this earthship together and we have a responsibility to protect it. And the thing about psilocybin mushrooms that I think is so warming to my heart is a cross-cultural, it's a bridge across cultures and continents, literally. These psilocybin mushrooms, 116 species that are active in the genus Psilocybe, and they grow, from Madagascar to the Arctic, to the tips of Chile, to Northern Europe, throughout the subtropics, circumpolar. These are all over the place, folks. So humans have had ready access to psilocybin for a long time. It is time for us to unify in our mission as Earth citizens to protect the ecosystem that has given us birth and to protect the heritage of our ancestors and protect the future of our descendants. So I'd like to say that chance favors the psilocybin mind. It certainly has helped me. And I want to welcome you all aboard the Starship. Let's journey together. We need you. The paradigm shift is now. Most importantly, be kind, be courageous. Let's be stronger together. Let's be respectful to each other. Let's act at a higher level. Let's not throw spears at each other. Let's extend the hand of friendship to be able to help heal us. And if we can heal our ecology of consciousness through mycology, then I think we'll have a much better chance for our collective future. So I want to thank CIS and all of you, and I'll be happy to take a few questions. Of course, I'm in stunned silence.
The questions are in the chat.
The questions are in the chat. Okay, I have been told the questions in the chat. Unfortunately, I cannot see any questions.
Paul, there's a button at the bottom of the Zoom window it says Q&A.
Yes,
Do you see
roger that.
If you click on that, you'll see there's 4 in there right now. We'll keep sending.
Okay.
If you just want to.
Okay, thank you. I have this now. Okay, the question from Jessica Jones. I'm intrigued by the concept that psilocybin mushrooms, speak to humans about the preservation of nature. Can you give us your thoughts on this? Have neuroscientists found evidence of the case? Do you think this is why set and setting is so important? Perhaps the message is more difficult to receive when there are elements are not present. Wow, what a great question. Thank you, Jessica. Every time that I do psilocybin mushrooms, I feel there is one giant consciousness. I feel all the voices of nature are calling to us. Many of the rocks are alive, trees are alive. You can hear insects moving around the ecosystem. Can you hear that inside of a hospital room with clinicians? They put on headphones and masks to have controlled stimuli. Are you getting the same information, the same impact? Yes, it can be an extraordinarily powerful experience. Yes, therapists are really important. Set and setting is critically important. The setting of nature, I think, far exceeds that of 4 square walls in a hospital room with physicians running around with lab coats. So I think it does inform us, but wouldn't you want to be better informed in nature by being in nature, or just esoterically conceptualizing it? This is why there have been several examples that people therapeutically in a hospital environment with psilocybin have wanted to go outside. And the physicians have had to restrain them. They can't have somebody tripping on psilocybin running outside, of course. But that impulse to be in touch with nature and to break out, I think, speaks volumes to the messages that people are eager to receive. So that's a great question. And I do believe and subscribe to the therapeutically controlled environments of the use of psilocybin by physicians for safety and harm reduction. I want to be very clear about that. But once your confidence level, once your experience level, once you have developed the skill sets, then I think the therapeutic benefits of using psilocybin in nature far exceeds that of a hospital environment. That's my own personal opinion. Oh boy, okay, so can you share any resource of finding quality therapists who specialize using mushrooms to treat depression? Well, the California Institute of Integral Studies is an obvious one. Of course, there's MAPS, maps.org. There's maps.ca, Canada. There's the Canadian Psychedelic Association. And there's a new organization called Roots to Thrive. If you go to my Instagram account, there's a link there specifically that recently 8 or 9 patients got a Section 56 exemption for end-of-life trauma. And under therapeutic guidance, they were giving high doses of psilocybin to help them. So the Canadian government is really beginning now, in a sense, ahead of the United States government, because they're allowing psilocybin mushrooms, where all the other clinical studies are with psilocybin, the molecule. As you saw from our cellular data, these psilocybin analogues are also giving neurogenic benefits. So with more neurons, more synaptic junctions, more alternative pathways for processing information, your brain is better informed, better neuroplasticity. I think these psilocybin analogues in the presence of psilocybin mushrooms confers a greater benefit. But so those are some of the obvious places that you can go for therapists. Question from Angela: what do you think of the mainstreaming of mushrooms, including them becoming administered through clinical therapy now? Sometimes I get disheartened that the relation of respect gets lost once it gets commodified. Do you think it loses indigenous connections and protocol? Wow. Yeah, folks, this is a problem. This is a big problem. But when you talk about things becoming commodified, I mean, you know, we consume corn. Corn has become a crop from indigenous people that has been commodified. Are all commodities bad? No, you won't be able to go to the grocery store to get many of the foods that you have. So this, people put it in perspective. However, with entheogenic substances, with these sacred psychedelics, I am very concerned about the rush for capitalization by economic opportunists. I've had 2 conversations with psilocybin startup companies with their boards, and when I took them to the mat, I said, how many of you have done a heroic dose of psilocybin? Nobody had done it. I was pretty astonished. You haven't gotten the message? So the message from psilocybin is cooperation and collaboration. It is not you going on social media and attacking people. It's inviting people for future cooperation and being able to listen and learn. So that's my biggest concern about the commodification, is whoever has the bigger bank account, whoever has more stock, whoever has been able to, patent things and excluding other people from using these substances. That really greatly concerns me. Psilocybin mushrooms and psilocybin should be available for free for anyone who needs them, and especially for anyone who cannot afford them. By the same token, those people who can afford these substances should pay, so the commercial vehicle is sustainable for allowing these to be offered for free. You can speak idealistically, everything should be for free, and that patents are bad. But if our patents are bad, we would not be on Zoom now. Go to the US patent page and look how many patents Zoom has to make this dialogue possible. Patents reward the investor for 17 years, or the inventor for 17 years, and then it becomes public domain. So ultimately, it benefits the commons. It incentivizes the investment, the development. So it's really important when people talk about this subject of commodification and patents, et cetera, be very, very nuanced in understanding, the benefits and the risks of both, because there are some great benefits. Question from Trace Bell: what are your thoughts about the potential of psychedelics being legalized on a federal level here in the United States in the next decade? Thank you. It's like the Equal Rights Amendment. I think it's 38 states, and then I had to go to Congress. Well, Washington State has a ballot that looks likely is going to be on the ballot next November. Oregon, most all of you I think know, has allowed for the therapeutic use. I'm on the advisory committees for the therapeutic use of psilocybin in Oregon. California is likely to be on the ballot. New York. This is interesting to me because politicians, even Rick Perry, the governor from Texas, he is in favor of the decriminalization, legalization of psychedelics. He's a vet. And I think a lot of vets have seen that the psychedelics have been one of the most powerful healing medicines ever. But what I'm getting to is that when we have 38 states in the United States where the ballots have been passed by the people, the politicians are no longer at risk because the people have spoken, and a government is supposed to reflect the will of the people. So this is a uprising of the population. All of us should be supportive and engaged in our communities for the decriminalization and the legalization and or therapeutic use legalization of psilocybin. The concerns we have are quality control, harm reduction. We have to have inspections. Mushrooms rot. People get food poisoning. This is a really big concern, folks. If you have not grown mushrooms, you don't realize maybe how perishable they are. And you can have a mushroom consumed with bacteria, you can dry it. And then the endotoxins of the bacteria, when you consume, you can end up getting horribly sick, potentially even dying from contamination. So we do need quality control. We do need the government to be able to monitor the commercial use of psilocybin. The recreational use of psilocybin is a civil right. It should be practiced by anybody who wants to practice it without government interference. That is my personal opinion. Question from Seth: have you watched Star Trek Discovery? If so, what do you think of the program's fictional portrayal of mushrooms and your namesake character? Well, I spent about 2 hours with Star Trek Discovery's writers when they called me up several years ago and said, we're in the dungeon, literally what they said, we are supposed to write the next Star Trek series. We saw your TED Talk. You mentioned mycology, or I mentioned terraforming on other planets. And then I mentioned mycology, and they said, what's mycology? And so I explained it to them. So I'm greatly heartened. I mean, I can't believe it. I'm a Star Trekkie, Star Trek fan for years. And I'm sort of numbed by the fact there's a character, Anthony Rapp does a great job. And what I told the writers, and this is so important, this is my own personal philosophy, I said, you have a sacred duty of being able to inform young people on the importance of biodiversity, the importance of tolerance, the importance of the prime directive, right? Not to interfere, with other cultures. And the fact they celebrate, diverse species from other planets that can come together with a common purpose, I think is just wonderful. So I told them, this is your opportunity to create a paradigm shift. And so I explained mycelium and all that. And then, of course, they took the ideas and they ran with it. I said I wanted nothing for this, but one day I want to become an astromycologist. And they go, well, we have an idea. And so they sprung this on me that they named a character after me. So thank you very much for that question. Can you speak to the potential spiritualizing effects of psilocybin experience? Yeah. I think psilocybin is deeply spiritual. And I believe there's a convergence of science and spirituality. I am not religious. To me, religious is like a silo where one person is personified as the leader, Jesus, Muhammad, whomever. Spirituality and science, the more we investigate nature, it's what so many indigenous people empathically know. But from our science point of view, we have to be able to construct the elements of the argument and the knowledge base to be able to come to a conclusion. I see that all now as merging. There's this sort of empathic intelligence that so many indigenous people just know. And yet now science is actually helping that knowledge in so many ways, because now we have all these other avenues that we can explore, so we can build the body intellect together. So to me, science and spirituality is converging to create the body intellect of knowledge that we so desperately need to create a better future. Folks, it's all hands on deck. We all have a keen understanding of the state of the world today. It's time for us to increase the intelligence quotients of our population so we can invent ourselves into a healthier future. What are the tips for a question from Quinn? What are the tips for finding the right wild growing environment for psilocybe mushrooms, cardinal direction, grass, moss, certain types, trees, fogs, rain levels? Yep, all of those. So psilocybin mushrooms, grow in a wide variety of ecosystems. I always thought it'd be a great graduate student, thesis to look at the tryptamine pathways throughout nature. You'd find tryptamines. If you look at all the tryptamines in nature right now, in trees and grasses, and you can see any cellular structure, but just tryptamines, what would you see? You see trees and grasses. They're everywhere. And so psilocybin is everywhere. It's a tryptamine. So psilocybes can grow in manure and pastures in the tropics. They can grow in the woods. But interestingly, the majority of psilocybin mushrooms follow the trails of human debris. Now, beavers can chip wood, and then psilocybin mushrooms can co-occur with beavers. But the association of chipped wood, and humans chip a lot of wood, it's like the psilocybin mushrooms are following us as we create this debris field. And they're like running behind us, almost calling out to us and saying, hey, you're having an impact on the ecosystem. Can you be a little softer? Can you be a little bit, show better leadership here? We're in this game also with you, and you're having an impact on us. So I think that, just like Michael Pollan's book, The Botany of Desire, I think there's this sort of inter-dialogue and dependency of psilocybin mushrooms calling out to us at a time to protect the ecosystem that gives us both benefit. So a question from an anonymous attendee. Dear Anonymous, question from the audience. Are there other alkaloids present in the flesh of the more common psilocybes, cubensis sinensis, that are responsible for some of the heavier and more uncomfortable body load. Those properties indigenous to pure psilocybin. Okay. Yep. Yeah, you hit upon something. There's the wood chip psilocybin mushrooms. There is something else that can co-occur, not with everyone and not with every sample, but we found a high correlation of what's called wood chip psilocybe paralysis. So with cyanescens and azurescens, there's oftentimes a loss of coordination and partial paralysis during the experience. And so the effect is not so much visual as it is body. Now, the difference between a medicine and a toxin is dose, as oftentimes said. This could be a new analgesic. It could be a neurotoxin. It could be, we don't know. We had not been able to identify this. The Liberty Cap mushrooms and Psilocybe cubensis, the ones that are most commonly consumed, very, very few reports of this type of temporary paralysis. Now, is this paralysis dangerous? Yes, it can be dangerous if you don't have the proper set and setting. What if you decided to go snow camping, right? And you ate a whole bunch of this and then you couldn't get back to your tent. You couldn't get back to your sleeping bag. Of course, that would be very, very dangerous. But that's sort of a secondary effect. People resolve from this usually the next day. By the end of the second day, they're fully back to normal. But we don't understand this, so your point is very valuable. Mushrooms are like miniature pharmaceutical factories. They're producing all sorts of compounds that impact us. But think about this, about 150,000 species of mushrooms. We've identified around 14,000 so far. But our indigenous ancestors and indigenous people today have discovered which mushrooms are best for them. How? It's like going into a library where every species, every book in the library is a different species, 14,000 species, whatever number you want to use. And our ancestors selectively pulled out each species and by trial and error determined that, hey, chanterelles are delicious and they're good for you. Shaggy beans are great. Porcini's great. And so we've isolated this big repertoire in this library down to about 200 good edible species. We narrowed it down further. Now we have over 100 psilocybin active species. Within the psilocybin active species, we narrow it down, and there's about 10 that we know interface with our microbiome, don't seem to have these other adverse effects that are associated with it. So yeah, so we are going through a selection process, selecting out the species that best are for us based on trial and error. People ask me, how do you know if a mushroom is edible or poisonous? We know if they're edible or poisonous from our ancestors who ate them before us. May not seem like a scientifically valid approach, but indeed, it's an empirical science. We've learned over the years which mushrooms and which plants, and which animals are beneficial. That process is ongoing today. So other questions here is, with the benefits, the question from, can you speak to the neurogenesis benefits of non-psychoactive mushroom supplements? Good question. We know that maitake, we know that lion's mane in particular. If there's one mushroom that I think is a hugely important in helping people, it's lion's mane. The lion's mane has been so well documented. I populate with my team, but I populate a website called mushroomreferences.com. It's unbranded, no advertising, just pure science. And I populate it for researchers and physicians. So if you go to mushroomreferences.com, you put in neurons or neurogenesis, you'll get a whole bunch of the scientific articles that have been published to date. In abstract form, because of copyright, we can't publish the entire article, unless they're open source. But please go to mushroomreferences.com and you can find all sorts of other species that have been implicated in having neurogenic benefits. Question from Steve. My daughter goes to liberal arts university on the West Coast and has started up a mycology club that's proven to be popular and continues to grow without effort. What vision, direction, and words of wisdom you share with this and many other students interested in mycology across the country? I love this question because I've been involved in mycological societies since I was very, very young. And I have to say, I would not have ever associated with many of those people in those societies if I knew their political or religious beliefs. But we came into common with our interest in mushrooms and our joy in mushrooms. And indeed, I was treated like a leper when I go to these conferences. There oftentimes would be like a force field of no man's land, or around me, that people didn't want to be associated with a long-haired hippie. But I joined a taxonomic group and a mushroom club, and I didn't have that experience. I was welcomed. So I think in this time of political divides, religious strife, all these things that divide us, mushrooms unite us. So I would encourage your daughter to open up her community, not just within the university, but get it to a library. Remember libraries, folks? They have a lot of empty rooms. They're happy to have people come together post-COVID or under COVID controls, of course, but open it up beyond your little bubble. This is the problem that I think we've become so insular in an echo chamber. And avoid politics, avoid religion, celebrate nature and mushrooms. You'll meet some really interesting people and eventually have some really interesting conversations. Well, what I love about the mushroom community is a lot of people have become environmentally educated and supportive of protecting the ecosystem, coming into a mushroom society where they had a different point of view prior to entering. So it's a great community, folks. It's a worldwide movement. And I think it's an uprising, literally from the underground, that we can all rejoice and participate in. And there's just so much out there. It's just so much fun. Okay, that ends my Q&A.